So we're very happy today to have Professor Ellis Goldberg in a talk organized by the Middle East Initiative. And Ellis is this year visiting here as the Kuwait visiting scholar. Ellis Goldberg teaches at the Department of Political Science at the University of Washington. He got his PhD 2 years before me at the same place, California, Berkeley. And he specializes in Middle Eastern politics. He has written several books and extensively on issues relating to labor, child labor, the Egyptian labor movement, and also on Muslim political movements. And his teaching interests also include broader issues of comparative politics and international political economy. Today he's going to tell us about the fascinating topic and very, very relevant these days of sectarian conflict in Egyptian politics, the third rail.
Well, can everybody, is this microphone close enough? Yes. This will be on the podcast too, I guess. Okay. So I wanted to thank the Kuwait Foundation for having me here as the Kuwait visiting scholar, and also to thank the Harvard Kennedy School and everyone who showed up today. I hope that you don't leave either disappointed or enraged. And let me begin. So, given the immense problems confronting Egyptians today, when more than 75% of the population between 18 and 29 is unemployed, when the value of the currency is dropping daily, sexual harassment is widespread, and the standoff between an elected president and the courts, as well as street fighting, has brought the country to a standstill, it may seem peculiar to suggest that sectarian violence is sufficiently important to be considered the third rail of Egyptian politics. Such violence is not very widely discussed in Egypt except when it occurs, and it's almost never discussed in academic studies of the country. I did a Google search this morning just to check on that perception of mine, and sectarian violence Egypt and Muslim Christian violence Egypt leads to almost no useful hits. In the world of Google, I think the most you get is something like 20,000 hits, which is almost nothing for Google. That's every possible indication of sectarian violence in Egypt. There have been some spectacular incidents of sectarian violence in the last 5 years, of which the best known, at least to Egyptians, are the drive-by shooting of Christians in Nega Hammadi in January 2010, the bombing of a church in Alexandria, January 2011, a pitched battle in the Cairo or the Giza suburb of Mbaba in April 2011, the army's assault on Christian demonstrators in the Maspero district of downtown Cairo, in which several people were actually crushed to death by armored personnel carriers in October 2011. Less well known, perhaps, especially to Americans and Europeans, are events such as the burning of a church in Seoul, March 2011, the flight of the entire Christian community of Dahshur in July 2012, and the recent clash that broke out in the northern Cairo suburb of Khusus and ultimately led to further fighting in front of Egypt's largest cathedral in the Abbasiyya district of Cairo, which was last month. That is April. These are completely apart from what we might consider more mundane and certainly less widely remembered incidents, even in Egypt, including a conflict over turning a factory into a chapel in the neighborhood of the Cathedral, expulsion of Copts from a community on the outskirts of Alexandria, and violence in Abu Uras in April of 2011, as well as criminal pursuits against Copts for allegedly defaming Islam. So these are not the only outbreaks of sectarian violence in Egypt since the revolution, and they are far from a complete list of events over the last 15 or 20 years. In fact, I have no confidence that the existing lists of such acts of violence are complete, although they may include all the occasions in which human lives were lost. I say this because my initial interest in this subject arose in the mid-1990s when I was asked to serve as an expert witness in a case involving a pogrom in Abu Uras in 1990. This particular event occurs in no contemporary lists, although it was widely reported in the Egyptian media at the time, and although many of the themes of imagined dramas of sexuality and the cynical use of violence were already apparent. For those who might be interested, I did publish a brief account of this event in Arabic in a now defunct journal. But I'd be happy to send anybody a copy of it if you're particularly interested. In comparison to the past decade in Iraq, not to mention India, this is a rather meager harvest of hatred, but my point is not that the extent of the violence itself is the problem, although the violence is certainly connected to broad and deep patterns of discrimination that do matter. What I want to propose is something more disconcerting. Conflict about the relationship between religious communities and between these communities and the state is a crucial feature of the definition of the nature of citizenship in contemporary Egypt. And Egyptians have no clear idea about exactly how to resolve it. That is how they want to resolve it. Neither, by the way, do we, if by we mean American and European academics interested in the future of Egypt and the Arab world. Or perhaps I should say we have no clearly agreed upon idea because we have too many ideas that are too poorly thought out. But as you've already noticed, American and European academics almost never refer to this issue. Let me begin with one very ordinary way that the Egyptian government and many Egyptians have of discussing sectarian violence. It doesn't really exist. And if it does exist, it doesn't really have any causal origins. And if it does have any causal origins, they lie in the work of outside agitators, that is, non-Egyptians, who are stirring up trouble among Christians. Therefore, there's really nothing to discuss unless you yourself have some desire to inflame Egyptian conflict. If nothing else, denial recognizes that sectarian conflict and violence are potently and potentially destructive. The problem, of course, is that denying the existence of the third rail and its mortal qualities does not actually eliminate them. A considerably more sophisticated view exists. Recognizing the difference in religious practice, there is a claim that Christians share the Islamic culture of the majority and even had a certain part in shaping it. It is thus common to hear voices, such as that of the noted judge Tariq al-Bishri, and he is far from alone, saying that Eastern Christians generally, unlike Western Christians, are the inheritors of a common culture and language with Muslims. The basis of this language and culture are the Quran and Islamic history, but those are no longer, as they were from the 7th to the 11th century of the Common Era, exclusive to Muslims. It is certainly true that Egyptian Christians, and especially educated Christians, are aware of and frequently knowledgeable about the Quran and the literary traditions of Muslims. What I'm going to put off for a second is exactly what that might mean in terms of a common culture. Another way of thinking about Muslims and Christians is precisely that they are not members of a shared history and culture, or that if they are, it is irrelevant. There are significant numbers of Muslims, both intellectuals and ordinary citizens, who believe that Christians should not, for example, have authority over Muslims. Thus, Christians should be ineligible to serve as President of the Republic, or as army officers, or as judges, because in each of these situations, they would exert authority over their Muslim fellow citizens. So there's two ways of thinking about it. Yet there's yet another way of thinking about the role of Christians in Egypt, which is based on the idea of citizenship. Christians and Muslims have the same rights and duties. This particular view is perhaps the dominant one within the Muslim Brotherhood today, and it is also widespread but far from universal among Egyptian Muslims. These concepts coexist with deep and enduring prejudices that have been described, although not particularly well documented or studied, in memoirs and popular accounts of daily practice, as well as being revealed casually in writing or conversation. And two of the most striking for me occurred in memoirs, which I went through a long period of reading memoirs. I'm not quite sure why. I also read Husaybi's memoirs of being a Saudi minister, which were quite fascinating. So two of the most striking to me are the late Raouf Abbas's description of persistent and relatively systematic, although completely informal, discrimination against Copts in Egyptian academic life. And his one example was actually the decision not to allow Yunan Labib Rizk to write the question on modern Egyptian history for the Thanawiya Amma, the secondary exam. because, as someone told Abbas, we simply don't let Christians write that question. Now, this isn't my making this up. This is in Raouf Abbas's memoir. And Galal Amin's comments, which he takes to be fairly straightforward and perhaps even a positive reference to contemporary Egyptian life, when he compares Christian suspicion of Muslim political behavior to the unfounded prejudice of a wife against an innocent husband who she suspects of engaging in extramarital affairs. The 2008 movie Hassan wa Mur'as evoked a sense of impending religious conflict, and for older Egyptian viewers it was probably made all the more compelling by the recollection of the 1954 movie Hassan wa Mur'as wa Kohen, a light comedy based on interactions between a stereotypical Muslim, Christian, and Jew. As many people pointed out at the time, Kohen is now gone, and it's not quite clear how long Mur'as will continue to be around. The more recent film ends in a frighteningly chaotic scene of violence, made only slightly bearable as Omar Sharif and Adil Imam join hands to lead their respective families to safety. It's I find it a very remarkable scene, and it reminds me a little bit of the final scene of Children of Paradise, and the dissolution of people into a crowd. One way to think about these conflicts is that they resemble conflict over race, color, and sex, with which we are quite familiar. We, after all, don't lack any of these prejudices in the United States, either over religion, race, color, or sex. And this would indicate that they are simply examples of irrational prejudice. Usually we expect them to be overcome by sufficient education, and they reveal a simple distaste or dislike of certain people. A somewhat different way to think about these conflicts, still comparing them to race, color, and sex, is simply that they are conflicts over group advantage. Excluding some members of society from certain positions clearly works to the advantage, generally speaking, of the excluders. And this has been a persistent theme in explaining racial discrimination and segregation in the United States. In a world which still existed when I was a child, when the aspirations of African Americans were limited to being Pullman porters, and in which women could generally not expect to do more than teach elementary school, no doubt discrimination conferred significant benefits on men who were eager to maintain that system. And it is probably not much more difficult to construct arguments about the denial of political rights in such situations, as well as those of economic advantage, since political rights allow one to maintain the economically desirable discrimination from the point of view of the discriminator, not obviously from the point of view of the person being discriminated against. The basic idea, obviously, would be that market forces would otherwise tend to undermine discriminatory practices by state action, that are guaranteed by state action in labor markets and elsewhere. With political rights, notably the vote, those who are discriminated against can sooner or later, emphasis perhaps on the later, dismantle the system that kept them in check. And this approach has significant explanatory power with regard to race, color, and sex, and it undoubtedly plays some role in understanding discrimination over religion. However, I think it works less well with regard to religion, or indeed an entire set of similar categories, including nationality, culture, and aspects of political behavior, for the simple reason that religion has cognitive content as well as emotional commitment. Now, obviously, we all know that religion has cognitive content. I assume we all know that. In one sense, that has been the core of the debate around Orientalism. There are schools of thought all around the world which suggest that there are fixed meanings to concepts found in Islamic history and law, such as jihad, dhimma, shura, and ummah, which structure the thought processes of Muslims and preclude accepting other concepts with equally fixed meanings, such as citizenship, democracy, or peaceful coexistence. Tremendous emphasis has been placed on the concept of jihad, for example, for at least the past decade. Does it incite suicide bombing? Does it incite crashing airplanes into buildings? Does it incite robbing jewelers in Upper Egypt? Does it imply simply putting one's whole effort into whatever one does? At one point in the distant past, jihad was simply the convenient legal designation for war. At another, it has come to mean spiritual improvement. Obviously, there's some cognitive content here, but it seems to be broad, contextually dependent, and clearly not a motive for action. Other schools of analysis would argue that such concepts have little or no fixity. Religion for these authors has some cognitive content insofar as adherents actually discuss concepts, but the concepts themselves are so universal as to have no specific meaning. We all basically believe the same thing, we just have slightly different words for it, and therefore there are no real differences between religion, religious practices, political ideologies, or anything else. All that is solid, as Marx would have said, melts into air. This debate, which has now been prolonged for several decades, and has adherents of both new ijtihad and the dismissal of secularism, seems to throw very little light on contemporary politics, although it does provide significant heat. And it especially provides, to my mind, little insight into the nature of conflict over religion. More to the point, we know that conflict between religious communities is rarely over religious doctrine, and especially has not been so for the last several hundred years. Whatever else Irish Catholics and Protestants were fighting over between 1969 and a decade ago, it was clearly not the nature of the Eucharist. So too, whatever was at stake in Imbaba, Dahshur, or Khusus, it was really not about whether Surat al-Ikhlas accurately describes the nature of divinity. The proximate causes of these events were the false claim that Christians had imprisoned a convert to Islam in a church, an argument over a shirt singed by a Christian ironer, a Makwegi, and a drawing of a swastika on the property owned by the Azhar. The swastika, by the way, as it turns out, was drawn in reverse. It wasn't technically the Nazi swastika, it was the opposite of the Nazi swastika. I assume because the boys didn't know exactly what they were drawing, and the boys who drew it were themselves evidently Muslim. So whatever cognitive content religion has, that in and of itself doesn't seem to be what people are fighting over. So if sectarian conflict and violence are not directly related to the cognitive content of religion, what is the relationship between content and conflict? I want to suggest, and this is purely a suggestion, which someday may emerge in a book, at least that's what the Guggenheim and the Carnegie Foundation people believe will occur, that what matters is that fundamental religious texts constitute moral communities. And the boundaries between these communities are therefore moral boundaries and partake of moral emotions such as disgust, rage, mercy, and obligation. That religious texts have cognitive content provides the possibility that members of the religious community can recognize each other and recognize that they share a common moral universe that unites them and divides them from other communities. It is the absence of such text and the moral discourse that they enable which has made it, I think, so difficult for some other cleavages in society to become the basis of political community. And here I'm thinking specifically of class. Despite what Karl Marx and many other people thought for over 100 years, class never became the basis for the establishment of political community. And this is a puzzle, it's a conundrum for political scientists. What, as one colleague wrote, went wrong in Kansas, and for others it's why are Egyptians not voting their class interest. But I want to point out that there are other communities that are also formed on the basis of texts, such as which we call constitutions, which also create moral communities, such as nations, and these also exist in tension with religious communities. One can, I'm proposing, be a member of more than one community. And it is in this light that I would place what many see as the increase in sectarian conflict in Egypt over the past several decades. Admittedly, there is an impressionistic quality to this, because as I've said, we don't really have much of an idea of how much conflict there is and the degree to which it's increasing. This is simply something we all take for granted, and it could very well be that some graduate student or assistant professor at the University of Massachusetts will take a closer look at the data and discover that there has been no actual increase. Or perhaps not at the University of Massachusetts, perhaps in Minya, I don't know. What I'm about to present grows in part out of my own puzzlement at reading some of the work by Egyptian jurists in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. They actually never referred to Sharia without an adjective. I was familiar, of course, with the idea of Islamic Sharia. And the extension to Jewish or Christian Sharia seemed logical enough. What was harder to understand was the reference to Anglo-Saxon, French, or German Sharia. Clearly, they were thinking in terms of something close to what we might call the legal system. But occasionally, when discussing how the origins of Roman law were related to Greek law, the idea seemed much less clear to me. Not until I read the work of Ridwan Sayyid did the underlying rationale become clear, at least as clear as it is to me today. The creation of moral communities is, as Sayyid tells us, speaking of classical Sunni political theory, based on a text and a project. In other words, you have to have a text around which a particular community is constituted, and it's what I suppose in the modern lingo we would call the discourse around that text that enables the community to come into existence. So as I'm suggesting here, people can be members of more than one moral community, but there is a question of who gets to interpret the text. And what I'm simply suggesting is that interpretation of the text, there was a famous book published many years ago in Arabic, in fact, with the title of Understanding the Text, which got its author into some trouble, Nasser Hamid Abu Zaid, that only people who really are committed to the community created by the text can validly interpret it. And this is something I've also been thinking about. If you're not a member of the community, then you can't actually, you may intellectually be able to interpret the text in the way that any of us can interpret a poem or a novel, but you can't make authoritative interpretations of the text. In the same way that I often ask my classes if they would accept someone who is not an American citizen to sit on the Supreme Court. And I can ask them, what if this person had been raised in the United States? What if they had been educated at, let's say, a small law school on the banks of the Charles? Okay, or perhaps in New Haven. I know they couldn't possibly have been educated on the San Francisco Bay. What if we took that kind of a person, but they just happened to be a French citizen, and they were just as smart as Nino Scalia? Would you accept their appointment to the court? And almost invariably, my students say no. They can't quite figure out why they say no, but it just seems unlikely and implausible to them. So what has happened, I think, in Egypt is that the question of what are the basic constitutive texts and who gets to interpret them have been reopened. In Egypt, for most of the 20th century, at least from 1923 until 1971, the basic text was the state constitution. Since 1971, what the government has introduced into the picture is the idea that the basis of legislation is Islamic Sharia. And as this has become a point of contention, then the question becomes open. Who can discuss the basic principles? Most of this discussion, I think, has been led astray by focusing on the cognitive content of classical Islamic law, rather than on the effect that having such content has on the nature of who can participate in the interpretation and creation of law. Articles 4 and 221 of the new Constitution, which basically place the Azhar in a political role that it hasn't had before, and that expand the scope of what constitutes Islamic Sharia in direct response to Supreme Court, the Supreme Constitutional Court's decision several years ago, have reinforced Article 2 in ways that I think at least clarify the underlying point I want to make. What again is less important here is what's less important here is the institutional weight of the Azhar than of what the articles reveal about how to have discussions around law. Although the new Constitution, like the old Constitution, guarantees the equality of citizens before the law, Article 6, it is not clear exactly how non-Muslims would be expected to participate in fundamental discussions about the nature of law, whose first principles are to be derived from the constitutive document of the Muslim community. In other words, there's no doubt that Christians can be elected to serve in the legislature or even the presidency or to serve on courts. The problem, it seems to me, is as long as what is being discussed in these settings is not phrased in terms of first principles, then indeed everyone can participate. But what happens when you want to go back to discussing first principles? What happens when you want to go back and discuss, for example, the role of whether riba is interest, or whether interest is actually in and of itself permissible? Then I think the issue becomes much more problematic. Now, again, there's no constitutional bar, And as al-Bishri and others have argued, Christians may be said to share the basic Islamic culture of the society. But they don't share a commitment to the community evoked by these basic texts. And one question that I think is worth thinking about, if nothing else as a thought experiment, is how easily Muslims would consider it appropriate for Christians to have basic discussions about the meaning of the Quran in the contemporary world. Just as I think it's problematic for Americans to consider the degree to which we imagine people who are French or Egyptian or citizens of the People's Republic of China having discussions about the application of the U.S. Constitution. Perhaps I'm wrong, and perhaps as the Supreme Court begins to open itself up to international jurisprudence, this will change. But my sense is that most Americans are not terribly taken with the idea that, for example, French judges should be in the business of expounding American constitutional law in an authoritative sense. So I want to conclude with a last remark about the nature of sectarian violence. I just wanted to open this up for discussion. And that's this. Sectarian violence is a problem in another way in Egypt, in that it usually involves not only the violation of criminal law and the right to equal treatment, but its resolution, if we can use that word, frequently escapes the legal system entirely. And this is another problem. That is, again, the violence, not necessarily the content of either Muslim or Christian legal or moral teachings. This in itself creates significant grievances when it occurs. And it occurs in a much wider range of occasions than you might think. So, for example, the murder of Imam Mustafa in Upper Egypt, who was killed resisting an act of sexual harassment by her harasser, was initially also led with the proposal to her father that he accept a community reconciliation meeting rather than that the murderer, or should I say the alleged murderer, be brought to justice in a court. This clearly creates an atmosphere of impunity in society as well as in the government, and undermines the notion of how society and the government should work. Now, what I'm referring to is almost invariably after incidents of sectarian violence, the solution proposed not only by members of the stronger party, that is the majority, but also by the government, is some form of community reconciliation rather than criminal prosecution. And in most of the cases that I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, the proposal of the government was that there should be some meeting between the members of the two communities that are ostensibly involved in order to reconcile the two sides. Sometimes this is presented as under the form of so-called Haq al-Arab. Sometimes it's presented as community reconciliation. It goes under a variety of names. But the point here is that the government contends that what is at issue is not the violation of rights of one party by another. That is to say, the transgression of the rights of one individual by another individual, which would, and this is not a question, by the way, of modernity or Western thought or anything else, because within each community there's no doubt how the government would treat these things, but conflict between two not fully equal communities. And the weaker party, whether it's the case, for example, of the father of Imam Mustafa, who is Muslim, or in the cases of others of sectarian violence, is perceived as by the weaker party as a denial of equality and an act really of further tyranny by the majority. One example of this feeling has led to the rather bitter comment circulated on Facebook that perhaps the German government should not have prosecuted Alex Wiens for the murder of Marwa Sherbini in Dresden in 2009, but rather have engaged in some form of community reconciliation between the Muslim community in Germany and the larger Christian society. And since Marwa Sherbini was a woman who was brutally murdered in court by someone who had totally unacceptable, this is simply, I think, indicative of the depth to which this sense of the role of community reconciliation is felt really as problematic. Now, more people were killed in the uprising against the old regime than in a decade of sectarian violence. So again, I'm not suggesting that the level of violence itself at the moment is so high as to be the problem directly. Rather, what I'm suggesting is it exposes the limitations on participation and citizenship in Egypt, and it explains in part why there is such widespread concern about this issue. That is to say, the fear that these incidents of violence, especially in a situation in which the state has become weak, can lead to the further unraveling of Egyptian society and the state. With that, I conclude.
Thank you.